Alright, so let's get into part 2 of the imperialism video here. So now, boop boop boop, lecture outline. Alright, we're doing Spanish-American War. The splendid little war. I think that's what they call it. Let's roll with it. Yeah, I'm almost positive. Anyways, okay, Spanish-American War. First of all, we're talking April to August of 1898, right? Now do you get why it's the splendid little war? Because it's only April to August. I can't type today. April to August. You can't even see that. And April isn't a month. There we go. April to August of, get in there. Get in there. Of 1898. Okay. So, boom! There it is. Okay. Let's go over some causes. There's a few big ones. Alright, first, Jingoism. Jingoism is extreme nationalism. Alright, so this isn't like, hooray, America, let's have a 4th of July parade, you know, and I'm excited about my country. This is like, America, we're better than you, and to prove it, we're going to kill you all and then take you over because we're the best. Yikes. Right, so Jingoism, extreme nationalism that pushes for an aggressive foreign policy. Right, so we had lots of people who believed in this Jingoism at the time. European countries were going out and building empires. We needed to do the same, but we also needed to do something militarily to flex our muscle to show that our military was just as big and bad as everybody else's. So we need some military action to keep pace with European countries to show that we're just as good as them. Yikes. All right. Then we've got this yellow press, this yellow journalism, sensationalist journalism. We had lots of journalists at this time, the yellow press, sensationalist journalists who were pushing for war. There was actually a Cuban revolt going on at this time. Cuba was under control of the Spanish. The Spanish controlled Cuba. There we go. That sounds better. So Spain controlled Cuba at this time. Little announcement there. I tried to pause it, but you probably heard part of it. So the Cubans had been revolting against Spanish rule for a long time, 1868 to 1878. It got renewed in 1895, a few years prior to the actual war breaking out. The yellow journalists and the yellow press like to talk about the Cuban revolt. America had a lot of money invested in Cuba. So a lot of our financiers wanted action, and then the yellow press made Americans sympathetic to the Cubans because there were some atrocities being committed by the Spanish. Some of their revolt was put down very brutally. Tens of thousands starved to death in some prisoner of war camps. But there were lots of magazines. The World magazine, published by Joseph Pulitzer. William Randolph Hearst had the New York Journal, and there were others that talked about how we needed to help the people of Cuba get rid of Spanish oversight and how we need to be more aggressive in our foreign policy. Congress should do something. So a lot of the American people read this yellow journalism, this yellow press, and then mix that in with Jingoism, and you have a lot of people who want to see action here. Then the Delome letter. Okay, Delome is the Spanish minister to the United States. His name was Dupuy de Leon. Sorry for the pronunciation. He's the Spanish minister to the United States. A letter that Delome had written was grabbed by Hearst's New York Journal and published. And basically it just criticized McKinley and made him look bad. It criticized his foreign diplomacy. It said that McKinley was weak. It said that the United States was weak and that they wouldn't do anything, and that the Spanish could basically do whatever they wanted in Cuba. So this made a lot of citizens upset. It made a lot of citizens in the United States mad. So you already have this extreme nationalism. You have the yellow press getting people fired up. Then you have the Spanish foreign minister to the United States, Delome, write this letter that criticizes the United States, calls us weak, calls the president weak and ineffective. People are starting to get seriously fired up. And then the Maine. It's in italics because it's a ship. The Maine was a U.S. naval ship that was in Havana. And on February 15th of 1898, the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and all 260 sailors on board were killed. Now, of course, newspapers, the yellow journalists blame the Spanish for this. There's actually no evidence to support this assertion that the Spanish blew up our ship. As historians have gone back in the past, we basically figured out that there was a lot of dynamite in the bottom of the ship, and dynamite sweats when it's hot, like a water bottle with condensation. And if that condensation pools, it causes the dynamite to lose its stability and it explodes. That's why the Maine blew up, is because they had dynamite packed poorly, basically, and it got too wet, and then it exploded. Craziness, right? But of course, this was what we needed. We had the slogan now, remember the Maine. The Spanish blew up our ship because they don't like us. It's time for us to go out and fight a war and prove to the world that we're just as strong as all these European powers and start to check Spanish power in the Americas. So the war, of course, is going to take place in Cuba because the Cuban revolt is part of it, because American financiers wanted action in Cuba against the Spanish because of the explosion of the Maine, but then it'll also extend into the Philippines, which will be the weirder part of it, right? So that's going to be kind of strange. So after the explosion of the Maine, President McKinley is in office, and he said, all right, we've got to go to war against the Spanish. We got to put an end to the bloodshed in Cuba. We've got to protect lives and money in Cuba. We've got to make sure that we can, have commerce, trade, and business anywhere in the country. And, we've just got to get the Spanish out of here so that way we can make sure that we can do business in this hemisphere in the way that we would like to. So McKinley's war message was very popular. He sends the message to Congress, and he gets his declaration of war. Now, an interesting part about the declaration of war is we also passed the Teller Amendment at this time to go along with it, which said the U.S. would fight the war but not take political control of Cuba. We'll kind of make good on that, but we're going to try to put Cuba under our influence in a lot of ways. Now, the war itself, it only lasted for 4 months. We're in the Caribbean, aka Cuba, and the Philippines. In Cuba, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, they lead a successful charge up San Juan Hill. The war ended after a few weeks on land and some sea fighting. It was not that widespread. We were able to overtake Cuba relatively easily. All right, just a little battle map here on the left. You can see, whoa, no, bring it to the front. Sorry about that. Left side, you can see the fighting in Cuba. You can see, not a lot going on here, right? And then on the right side, we have some of the fighting in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines was kind of like the weird part. Roosevelt, without McKinley's knowledge, had actually ordered the Navy to go take the Philippines because the Philippines were also controlled by the Spanish. So McKinley said, yeah, we're going to take over Cuba to get the Spanish out of there. He didn't really understand that Teddy Roosevelt, his vice president, was also ordering the Navy to go take over the Philippines. But again, it's a pretty small engagement, and before you know it, we now have control of Cuba and the Philippines, and we've driven the Spanish out of both areas, and now our national, or I should say our global influence is getting larger. Here's Teddy as a Rough Rider. He actually led, oh, that's a terrible pixelated picture. He actually led soldiers in the Spanish-American War, went out there and did a lot of the fighting himself. Pretty crazy, right? Okay, so the war ends, again, pretty quickly, all right? So we're going to take control of Cuba, all right? Spain recognizes Cuba's independence. We are going to pass the Platt Amendment, which said that the U.S. could maintain a permanent military base in Cuba and the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to maintain law and order, but we upheld the Teller Amendment, all right? So we got out of Cuba in 1901. We gave them their political independence, but we also passed the Platt Amendment, which said the U.S. can maintain a permanent military base, aka Guantanamo Bay, in Cuba, and the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to maintain law and order. And we will intervene in Cuba in 1906, 1909, and 1917. So we're going to see a lot of tension building there. It makes sense why we don't get along with Cuba in the long run, because we were always trying to control Cuba. All right, a couple other things. The United States also acquired Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam in the Pacific. Right? So we also had annexed Hawaii earlier. So now we have Puerto Rico and Guam and Hawaii. All right, so here's Hawaii, 1898. All right, here's Guam, 1898. Here's Puerto Rico, 1898. Obviously, here's Cuba. Here's the Philippines. So 1898 is a huge year for us when we're starting to take over these areas. Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, we don't take control, right? But obviously we have a lot of influence there, and we're going to send troops in on a number of different occasions. Now, the Philippines was sold to the United States for $20 million. So we had done a little fighting there. Spain eventually agrees to sell us the Philippines for $20 million. Now, that part had the most controversy. there was a lot of debate between anti and pro-imperialists, those who were pro-imperialism and anti-imperialism, over how we could justify taking over the Philippines, and how we could really justify going out and taking over all these different areas, right? Because there's lots going on, right? I mean, don't forget about Alaska earlier in 1867. There were a couple other small islands you could see here, Baker Island, Jarvis Island that we had taken over earlier. Midway eventually would take over American Samoa in 1899. So we're building this Pacific Empire after we have conquered the continent. We've also grabbed Alaska. So there are people that like this, and there's people that don't. Okay, of course. You know, the big question is, how can the U.S. justify its role as an imperial power if it's based off democracy, liberty, and freedom of choice? Now, if you're an anti-imperialist and maybe a member of the Anti-Imperial League, you're going to really feel that going out and building this empire is a violation of democratic principles. And, you know, really using all this force, it's just going to get the U.S. entangled in foreign affairs that we don't need. The anti-imperialists, like I said, started a club, the Anti-Imperialist League. William Jennings Bryan, a prominent populist, and Andrew Carnegie were the founding members of that said, we're violating our democratic principles by building an empire, and we're just going to get too involved in foreign affairs. But then you've got the pro-imperialism school, the pro-imperialist. Teddy Roosevelt was the big one, and McKinley was too. They said, listen, we need these imperial possessions to become a world power. There's our religious leaders who are saying we can bring Christianity to these people. There's our international Darwinists who are saying we can make their lives better by bringing them a better government, a better society. And there were a lot of people in the pro-imperialism camp who said, listen, if we don't take over these lands and these areas, some European country is going to. So we might as well just go in and we might as well do it ourselves. So Congress agreed to take over the Philippines eventually, and we bought it, and we eventually take it under our control. Now, of course, the Filipinos were not happy over this. They eventually rebelled and fighted against U.S. rule for a long time, but the United States was simply too powerful. So we went out and built this empire at this time period, right? Just another map showing the same thing that we saw before, just in a different way. We're also eventually going to start to have lots of influence over Central, South America, and the Caribbean. So this map shows all the different areas that the United States eventually is going to get involved in Central, South America, and the Caribbean as we start to really become more of an imperial power, right? And you can see all the different things. I mean, look at Nicaragua, how many times we're down there. It's crazy, right? We're getting involved in Mexico a lot. We're getting involved in Cuba a lot. We're putting things down in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Of course, we take over Puerto Rico. We're getting involved in Honduras. We're getting involved in Venezuela. We create Panama. I mean, there's all these different things that we're getting involved in. So the United States now feels like it's this giant power, because we are. Starts to flex its muscles, well, that's going to cause a lot of tension and eventually a lot of resentment. That's why a lot of our neighbors in this hemisphere don't like us very much and don't get along with us, because we've kind of gotten all up in their business many different times. So when we look at the significance of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. is now clearly a world power. It is absolutely a world power. I mean, again, I can just grab this map quick so we can get a look at it as we talk about this. I mean, we now clearly have an empire built. Right? Puerto Rico, eventually the Virgin Islands are going to come in. We've got the entire continent, Alaska, Midway, Hawaiian, Johnson Island, Kingman Reef, Baker Islands, Guam, Philippine, all these different areas. We clearly are a world power. We also really, more than ever now, need to build a canal through Latin America to connect our possessions. We need to be able to connect the east and west coast of the United States and our Caribbean possessions and our Pacific possessions, and do so efficiently. Also, last big area of significance for the Spanish-American War, other nations are starting to recognize our power now, because we are more mighty than ever before. We have this large navy we're building. We have a military that can go out and really show our influence. So other nations started to recognize our power. One specific example of that is eventually we pushed through an open door policy where we convinced other countries to abandon spheres of influence in China for open trade in China. Countries didn't have to do this. We just eventually asked for it right around 1900 and said, listen, the United States wants to trade in China, and we think everyone should be able to. So instead of European countries having this sphere of influence where they're the only ones we can trade, we want to be able to trade there, and we think you should all just do this. And everyone just goes, okay, open door policy it is. Because if we don't say this, the United States is going to come flux its military might on us. So lots going on with imperialism. Lots going on with the Spanish-American War. The United States is growing up and starting to really go out and build an empire.